Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going into some very difficult territory. I think this might be one of the most intellectually challenging and frankly uncomfortable expeditions we've ever taken.
Not agree with that.
We are going to be tackling the architecture of exploitation, and we're doing it through a very specific analytical lens. It's provided by Lev Neymotin, PhD, and it's all focused on the facts and, more importantly, the structures surrounding the Jeffrey Epstein case.
That's right. And before we really jump in, it's so important that you, the listener, understand what our mission is here. This whole deep dive is based on a set of documents that try to move past the initial human reaction.
That discussed the outrage.
Exactly, which is completely warranted, of course.
Yeah.
But those reactions, they don't always lead to durable solutions. So our mission, and it's really the author's goal, is one of cold, objective understanding.
Right.
We're looking at 3 linked analyses that attempt to synthesize these. Just incredibly disturbing facts into clear, structural, and this is the key part, observable biological patterns.
I found the origin of this whole analysis really resonant. The author is very explicit about his motivation. It came from this deep, personal, almost philosophical struggle. He says he felt compelled to understand, on a structural level, how an operation that he calls morally filthy and structurally predatory could even exist, let alone persist for decades.
And the question that hangs over it all?
The central, baffling question, why? Why did so many powerful, educated, successful men, why did they willingly walk into and participate in this destructive system?
And what's so fascinating is how he frames it. He starts from a place of, profound moral and religious objection. He uses the words deep contempt and genuine dismay.
So he's not detached from the horror of it.
Not at all. He lays his own ethical framework down on the table. He acknowledges the horror, but then he insists that to really learn anything, we have to achieve a kind of forensic detachment. The whole purpose of the analysis is just to rigorously understand the human mechanisms, the structural components. Because, his logic is if we can understand the predictable patterns, maybe we can develop proactive defenses against it happening again. It's like applying clinical detachment to a horror show.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We should start with that overview document and the personal story that really framed his whole investigation. He jumps right into the political noise, doesn't he?
He does, and it's the perfect backdrop. He uses that chaos to show why his purely analytical stance is so necessary.
Right, the story with his friend.
Exactly. He recounts this really vivid conversation with a friend who he describes as a dedicated critic of the former president. And it just perfectly crystallized the immediate reflexive polarization of this whole topic.
So the news breaks about the documents.
And the friend's immediate evidence-free reflex is to say, Donald Trump must be fighting the release. He's trying to hide something. An instant partisan accusation, completely overriding any need for facts.
Which, as the author points out, was proven factually incorrect almost immediately.
Almost instantly, yeah. Trump actually came out and publicly supported the release, told Republicans to vote for it. And the author observed something else in that moment, something critical. Even as this whole complex picture was just starting to emerge, the documents themselves seemed to point towards individuals connected to, well, influential Democratic circles.
Major donors, academic elites.
Yes, names linked to Harvard,
Yeah.
high-profile figures like Bill Clinton, Larry Summers. He saw this initial political clustering was clearly visible, and yet his friend was, he says, almost offended.
Offended why?
Offended that the author chose to look at the situation first as this terrible systemic crime and only second as a political football.
That detail is so essential, I think. It shows how he just refused to get into the moral or political finger-pointing. He wasn't interested in whose team the perpetrators were on. He just zoomed out and asked the bigger question. Why did this whole situation, regardless of party, take the shape it did among this specific group of men?
And that is the pivotal shift. He uses that political conversation to establish his core analytical position, which is, it's the key takeaway for anyone reading that first essay.
Okay, so what is it?
He emphasizes that his goal is not to blame, and it's not to excuse. The focus is on establishing that the behavior we're seeing here stems from what he calls a unique, biologically controlled way of behavior in society. And that this biological driver often overrides a person's conscious moral code.
Wait, I need to press on that point because it could sound like convenient determinism. If he's saying this is biologically controlled, isn't he risking excusing the horrific choices these men made?
That's a fair and a necessary question, and he's careful about it.
Yeah.
He argues that it's a mechanism, not a justification.
Okay.
He believes the sheer drive, the engine power, you could call it, is a biological reality. The management of that drive and the choice to seek out these controlled, illicit outlets for it, that remains a moral and a cognitive failure. But to understand the failure, he says, you have to first understand the raw power of the engine. If you ignore the biological driver, the whole thing just becomes this unsolvable moral mystery rather than a predictable pattern you can actually analyze and maybe mitigate.
So it's about moving past this simple binary of good people versus bad people to really examine the architecture of temptation and predation, and it's all anchored in these measurable human dynamics.
Exactly. And that brings us right to the core thesis of the whole thing: biology, intelligence, and drive. And we have to start with the uncomfortable truth he calls biological asymmetry.
Which is the obvious starting point, I guess, but a necessary one.
It is. The fundamental structure of the operation was men supplying young women to older men. It was never in any systemic way the other way around.
Right.
And the source is totally unambiguous here. This isn't a mystery tied just to social conditioning or wealth or access. It's fundamental biology. Specifically, the high levels of testosterone that drive male sexual pursuit, competition, risk-taking, and in some contexts, aggression. He calls this drive hardwired.
Okay, so that biological asymmetry of sexual pursuit, that's a foundation that's, relatively well understood. But here's where his analysis gets really complex and maybe more controversial. Why do so many highly intelligent, high-achieving men, why do they, statistically, seem to get involved in these explosive sexual scandals at a rate that is demonstrably more than random chance would suggest? If they're so smart, shouldn't they be better at managing risk?
This is the absolute crux of the Neymotin analysis.
Yeah.
As he looked at the specific demographics of the men around Epstein, he noticed they weren't just wealthy. They were often men of genuinely unusual intelligence, accomplishment, high influence, far above your average CEO.
Right.
And he links this directly to the idea that high intelligence and high drive are often inseparable partners.
Okay, let's delve deep into that mechanism. How exactly does intelligence amplify drive? Give us the physics of this amplified internal energy he talks about.
Okay, think of it in terms of neurological output. The source suggests that the same powerful neurological capacity that lets a man innovate in physics or lead a massive company or compose a revolutionary piece of music.
So high cognitive function.
Right. That function often comes coupled with a globally amplified internal energy. If you have a massive engine in a car, it doesn't just power the wheels. It powers everything. These men, he says, run hotter.
Run hotter. I like that.
This high output system powers their mental focus, their creative ambition, and yes, critically, their sexual energy. The energy source is shared. It's not neatly compartmentalized. You can't just easily throttle it in one area without it affecting the others.
So a man who has the drive to stay up all night working on a complex financial model might also be driven by an exponentially amplified, persistent sexual urge. It's the same internal motor pushing all the systems to maximum.
Precisely. And the inherent challenge for these people is regulation. While their intelligence gives them the ability to plan and calculate risk, the sheer force of that internal energy can overwhelm their capacity for self-regulation.
Especially under certain conditions.
Especially under conditions of stress, opportunity, and, the removal of moral constraints. The cognitive conflict is massive. The smart part of the brain knows the risk, but the high drive part demands fulfillment.
That immediately reframes the whole case. It becomes less about an individual moral failing in a vacuum and more about a structural failure to manage an extremely high-powered, volatile internal system, a system that Epstein then expertly provided an outlet for.
That's the core insight. And to prove this is a recognizable pattern, not just some anomaly, the author brings up several pretty striking historical and cultural examples.
Let's spend some time on those, because I think they bring the concept to life in a way that just talking about statistics can't. He starts with Albert Einstein.
Einstein, yeah. A genius whose work is foundational to modern physics. Yet, his private life was notoriously volatile. It was full of passionate affairs, complex family entanglements, very demanding relationships. The author uses him to show that this incredible intellectual energy rarely operates in a vacuum of moral or emotional tranquility.
And you see that same intensity in the arts. Pablo Picasso.
Picasso's genius transformed 20th century art, but his personal life was marked by this relentless, often possessive, and notoriously complex series of relationships. The source argues that his artistic fire and his intense sexual life were, in his view, fueled by the same singular internal engine. The entity manifests as a desire to dominate, to consume, to create, both in the studio and in the bedroom.
It extends to literary figures, too. Lord Byron, a revolutionary in poetry who openly said he was driven by uncontrollable passions that constantly got him into scandal and debt.
Yes, or James Joyce, the architect of modern literature. His intimate letters revealed the same kind of intense, often unconventional sexual energy that you see distilled and controlled in the complexity of his writing. The point isn't that they were just immoral, it's that the volume knob on all their internal systems seemed permanently turned up to 11.
We should also mention the performing arts. Richard Wagner, the composer. His operas are massive, sprawling, complex works of genius, and he was equally dramatic and disruptive in his personal life.
And Rudolf Nureyev, the legendary ballet dancer, his artistic genius required this unbelievable physical and creative intensity, and it was famously paired with an intense, high-risk sexual energy.
So what's the synthesis here?
The synthesis the author draws is just. It's undeniable. These are not random outliers. They form a recognizable pattern where hyper-intelligent, highly creative men often possess stronger, more volatile, and less controllable sexual drives. Genius, he concludes, doesn't just stay neatly contained in the studio or the lab. It permeates their entire behavioral system.
Okay, I get the pattern he's pointing to. But let's go back to the skepticism for a moment. Doesn't this reliance on, biological and intellectual determinism risk generalizing from a small, highly visible sample of famous people?
That's a critical challenge. And the author addresses it implicitly by emphasizing that this pattern is just the raw material that Epstein exploited. Plenty of high-drive, intelligent men manage their urges constructively.
Right. Through their work or stable relationships?
With sublimation.
Exactly.
The source argues that Epstein targeted the subset who were already struggling with regulation or who felt, entitled to get around conventional moral standards. Epstein's brilliance, if you can call it that, was in identifying the psychological profile that was ready to fail.
And despite this powerful link between intelligence and drive in men, the author is quick to remind us that the biological asymmetry remains the governing constraint.
Absolutely. The analysis makes it crystal clear. Even highly intelligent women with equivalent internal drive and ambition do not exhibit this same aggressive predatory sexual pattern. Biology is stubborn. The testosterone-based asymmetry persists, regardless of IQ. The structure of exploitation, older powerful male, younger female, is therefore fundamentally rooted in that male pursuit biology.
So we have the ingredients. High drive, linked to high intelligence, operating within the constraint of biological asymmetry. Now let's apply that lens directly to the Epstein network, the structural setup.
And when you view the Epstein network through this specific non-judgmental lens, the whole structure subtly shifts. It goes from random depravity to predictable consequence. Epstein wasn't just targeting any wealthy, older man with a sexual appetite. He built his world around a specific, highly predictable psychological profile. Intelligent, powerful, ambitious, and operating with those elevated, often volatile internal drives. He selected clients who met this profile because he understood their internal complexity made them uniquely vulnerable to his controlled, risk-mitigating service.
And this framework also helps us understand the political and cultural clustering without having to resort to the kind of partisan finger-pointing the author explicitly wanted to avoid.
Precisely. The author observes that the client list probably leaned toward Democratic-aligned individuals because Epstein's environment, the circles he socialized in, the money he managed, the institutions he courted like Harvard, Wall Street, philanthropic foundations, they all tended to lean progressive or Democratic.
So it's a secondary factor.
It's a secondary factor that influenced who Epstein could access, not why those men had the biological drive in the first place. It's an issue of correlation based on social proximity, not causation based on ideology.
But the source does provide a critical cultural component that he thinks influence behavior beyond just who you hang out with.
He does. He suggests, and he presents this as an influential factor, not an absolute rule, that individuals who align with traditional or conservative religious norms often have an additional self-imposed ethical constraint that might temper their drives, even if imperfectly. Conversely, he says, progressive Democrats often tend to discard those established religious or traditional ethical frameworks, seeing them as relics or oppressive structures.
So if you combine a high-drive individual, that massive internal engine, with a cultural framework that champions discarding traditional moral guardrails, the risk of explosive, unregulated behavior goes way up.
That's the hypothesis. The drive is biological, but the moral speed limit is cultural. For some men in those progressive elite circles, they may have lacked the internal or external brakes that others, perhaps in more religiously constrained circles, still had. This convergence of high drive, high opportunity, and potentially fewer moral constraints makes the resulting behavior, however horrific, structurally predictable.
And that really wraps up the overview document with a powerful, if grim, conclusion. The Epstein case is less a mystical anomaly that requires hysteria and more a predictable structural failure. It's rooted in the specific convergence of biology, intelligence, power, and opportunity.
It was a structural risk that materialized exactly as human dynamics predicted it would. The horror is in the execution, not the improbability of the underlying mechanics.
Okay, so moving from that macro analysis of the type of man involved, we now need to transition to the microstructure of the crime itself. This takes us to the second, and I think equally fascinating, document, to the imaginary code of conduct.
This transition is so crucial. We're moving from understanding the driver, which is the biology, to understanding the necessary structure, the operation itself.
Right.
And the author is meticulous in stressing that this is a constructed analytical tool. It is not a real document that was discovered. It's an intellectual model built entirely on understanding the high-status psychology of the clients and the operational necessities for running a stable, high-risk endeavor for years and years.
Okay, so what is the utility then? Why dedicate an entire document to imagining a code that never actually existed?
Its utility is psychological and structural. Clients of this caliber, world-renowned, powerful, with massive reputations to protect, they don't just wander into obvious danger. They demand and expect a controlled environment for their fantasy fulfillment.
Mm.
They need the structure and the boundaries to feel safe from legal and reputational risk, even as they're violating fundamental moral boundaries. The hypothetical code helps us map out those unstated demands and the rigorous operational framework Epstein would have needed to maintain that illusion of discretion and stability.
Okay, let's detail some of these hypothetical rules for clients, which were designed primarily to manage risk and keep the operation running long term.
The rules are all designed to keep the interaction in a legally ambiguous zone. And the most startling rule in this constructed model is the strict prohibition. No sexual intercourse.
Wow.
Encounters were supposed to be restricted to massage, nudity, conversation, and non-penetrative behaviors like touching or mutual masturbation.
Wait a minute. If the whole point of the operation was to satisfy these amplified sexual drives, why would the operator impose a strict ban on intercourse? That seems totally counterproductive to what the client wants.
It speaks volumes about the priority of risk management over immediate gratification for both the client and the operator.
Okay.
Penetrative sex instantly escalates the legal jeopardy dramatically. It introduces risk factors like pregnancy, STDs, higher felony charges. For the high-status client, they were buying a low-risk indulgence. The absence of intercourse was a fundamental safety feature that protected their public reputation and reduced the operator's potential prison time.
So the men were purchasing a legally controlled fantasy, one that allowed them to skirt the most severe consequences of their behavior. What about the boundary-setting rules? The ones designed to prevent things from spiraling out of control emotionally or physically.
The code would have strictly forbidden any form of physical aggression or coercion. No striking, no grabbing, no restraining. The client was absolutely forbidden from going off script. They couldn't make requests outside the agreed script.
Any attempt to escalate was supposed to trigger an immediate session termination. This rule existed to protect the high-status client from himself. Any act of violence or overt coercion would immediately shatter the plausible deniability that Epstein worked so hard to maintain.
And there were financial and emotional boundaries, too, to keep the whole thing strictly transactional and compartmentalized.
Absolutely essential. The code would prohibit any promises of romance, marriage, future support. Gifts were strictly limited to small, untraceable amounts of cash. No attempts at independent contact or payment outside the arranged system. This was crucial for two reasons. One, to keep the women entirely reliant on the operator, and two, to prevent the high-status client from leaving an independent, traceable financial trail that could be used against him. Everything had to be neat and discreet.
Now let's look at the other side of it. The corresponding rules for Staff Epstein, designed to manage all the variables and enforce this perceived safety for the clients. These rules focused intensely on client screening. They weren't looking for unstable rich guys. They were targeting older, highly educated, socially stable men who valued their reputation, men who understood and could respect the parameters of the operation. Predictability was paramount.
I see.
The operation also relied on meticulously maintaining the massage appointment framing for that plausible deniability. Staff supervision, checking rooms, being nearby, was for control, but it was indirect. It emphasized plausible deniability rather than, say, active watching.
What were the absolute red flags, the things that would trigger an immediate termination of a client relationship?
Anything that threatened control or secrecy. The source hypothesizes that immediate termination triggers would include client intoxication. A drunken client is unpredictable and a huge risk. Emotional breakdown from either the client or the young woman was another trigger. And most tellingly, any sign of the client making political or blackmail-relevant statements was an absolute no-go. The business was transactional discretion. Anything that hinted at leverage or future coercion was a liability the operation would discard immediately.
This brings us to the crucial psychological framing section of the code, which really explains why these intelligent, high-status men went along with such a dangerous arrangement in the first place.
This is the genius of the predatory structure. The operation framed the experiences as exclusive, safe, and meticulously controlled. This was the premium service they were paying for, the guarantee of discretion and boundaries.
Okay.
And critically, the young women were framed by language, training, the environment, as being trained, willing, and experienced. This narrative was constructed, even when it was demonstrably untrue, to significantly reduce client anxiety and maintain the illusion of consent.
So the men weren't just buying sexual access, they were also buying the narrative of cleanliness. They were purchasing a low-risk environment that let them indulge their amplified drive without having to immediately face the legal or moral reality of exploiting a child or a vulnerable person.
That's the structural insight. They outsourced their moral accountability.
Yeah.
The code provided the necessary cognitive dissonance. It allowed them to believe they were participating in something controlled and non-coercive, satisfying their need for both indulgence and reputational safety.
But how does this detailed hypothetical code stack up against the known facts from testimony? We know the operation was a horrific crime.
The author details both the consistencies and the inconsistencies, and this is where the analytical model meets the grim reality. On the consistency side, testimony confirms that encounters were often strictly framed as massages.
Right.
And many women reported encounters that were restricted to nudity, touching, and masturbation, consistent with the strict risk control tactic that no intercourse rule. But the inconsistency is the most devastating fact. Some women did report intercourse and overt violence. This proves that any internal boundary the operation had was violated, ignored, or inconsistently applied based on the victim's vulnerability or the client's insistence.
So the code wasn't a guarantee of safety for the girls, it was a psychological and legal firewall for the client.
Precisely. And the utility of the analysis remains, even with the violations, because it helps us understand the psychology of the clients. They sought a controlled, low-risk encounter with the illusion of safety and discretion. This understanding is invaluable for those trying to help the victims.
And that leads us seamlessly into the third and final document, which translates this cold structural understanding into a framework for compassion and recovery, a guide for social workers and therapists.
This shift is so vital. The author moves from analysis to empathy. The guide applies the insights about biological drivers and structured coercion directly to the victim's experience. The core distinction made in the guide is that recovery is not primarily about processing what happened physically. It's about healing the multi-layered, chronic psychological injuries that resulted from the system of exploitation.
What are the key types of psychological harm that the guide identifies as resulting from this controlled structure?
The guide identifies several deep, complex injuries directly related to that controlled environment. Coerced and confused consent, where the victim complies without truly consenting. Violation of autonomy, chronic shame, the internalization of the blame, identity fragmentation where the self splits into different parts just to survive, and fundamental breaches of trust. So effective help has to be highly structured, trauma-informed, and focused on reclaiming the self.
Section I of the guide focuses on understanding the specific patterns of harm in these controlled operations. How does it suggest practitioners dispel that common misconception of self-blame?
By using psychoeducation to illuminate the process. Many survivors struggle with self-blame, repeating thoughts like, nothing violent happened, or I could have left, or I agreed.
Right.
The guide stresses the critical distinction between compliance versus consent. Compliance is adhering to a script or a demand to avoid a negative outcome. Consent is a free, enthusiastic choice.
That distinction, compliance versus consent, that has to be therapeutically huge for helping survivors reframe their experience. It lets them externalize the control.
It gives them the language to articulate what they couldn't name at the time. The guide details the patterns they suffered, the grooming dynamics, the controlled, scripted interactions, conflicted consent where you're internally saying no, but externally cooperating,
Yeah.
and entrapment or silence due to intense fear of blame or retaliation. The controlled environment was designed to maximize compliance while minimizing overt physical coercion, which makes the shame of compliance the deepest wound.
Section 2 then moves into 5 therapeutic priorities, which follow a strict phase-oriented model.
And this is critical. The therapeutic model has to prioritize stabilization before processing. The first phase is always safety and stabilization. This includes establishing physical safety, creating grounding practices, developing emergency calming plans, creating a safe person list. You have to prevent re-traumatization by building a foundation of control and predictability for the survivor.
And then they move immediately to tackle the core emotional injury, which is shame.
Priority number 2 is breaking the cycle of shame. The guide calls shame the core psychological wound in structural exploitation. This involves intensive cognitive reframing. The practitioner must repeatedly and firmly tell the survivor, you had no real choice. You were a subject in a controlled environment designed to manipulate you. This requires self-compassion exercises and restructuring that it was my fault narrative into I was coerced.
Once that core emotional wound is being addressed, the next steps focus on reclaiming the self and agency.
Priority 3 is rebuilding autonomy and agency. The survivor has to relearn how to make decisions and establish boundaries because their autonomy was completely violated. This involves assertiveness training and boundary rehearsal exercises, starting with small, safe decisions and gradually increasing the complexity to restore their sense of self-determination.
What about the physical aspect of the trauma? Survivors often report feeling detached or disconnected from their bodies.
That's priority 4, healing the body identity disconnect. Trauma is often stored somatically, meaning the body holds the memory even if the conscious mind resists. This requires somatic therapy and trauma-informed movement to help the survivor integrate and safely inhabit their physical self again. The goal is to transform the body from a site of exploitation into a source of safety and self-knowledge.
And finally, the very complex issue of sexuality recovery.
Priority 5 is sexuality recovery, and this is focused entirely on healing the distortions caused by exploitation. It's about separating sex from control, from trauma, from transaction. The goal is healing the capacity for intimacy and pleasure that is non-coerced. It's not about encouraging specific behaviors, but allowing the survivor to redefine their healthy sexual self on their own terms.
The guide also briefly mentions some specific evidence-based methods in Section 3 that are used to treat this complex trauma. We should probably clarify these for our audience.
Absolutely. For restructuring those distorted beliefs, the cognitive errors like I am unlovable or I could have left, trauma-informed CBT, TICBT, is recommended. It helps the survivor challenge and replace those destructive thought patterns with realistic, self-compassionate ones.
And what about those deeply embedded, nonverbal traumatic memories that the body holds? How do you address those?
For processing those nonverbal, often visual or somatic memories, methods like EMDR are essential. That's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It essentially helps the brain's information processing system file away traumatic memories properly, reducing their emotional charge. Similarly, somatic experiencing is used to gently bring the body out of its frozen fight, flight, or freeze state by tracking and releasing physical trauma patterns.
Finally, the guide mentions internal family systems. That sounds a little abstract. Can you break that down?
IFS, internal family systems, is a highly effective model for complex trauma. It views the psyche as containing various parts, the vulnerable child part, the protector part, the shamed part. The therapeutic goal is to help the adult resilient self, which is called the self, to integrate and comfort the younger self that was frozen in the trauma, allowing the person to become whole again. It moves the focus away from pathology and toward internal connection and healing.
We've moved through an incredible amount of information, from the macrobiological analysis of drive down to the microstructure of the crime, and finally to the specific clinical intervention required for healing. It is a powerful, if terrifying, sequence.
That synthesizes the documents perfectly. The entire suite of analyses is driven by that singular goal, moving beyond just moral reaction into predictive and preventative understanding. We looked at the biological drivers, the structure of the crime illuminated by that hypothetical code, a structure built on high-status demands for controlled safety. And finally, we arrived at the practical, human response in the Guide for Recovery.
The author's ultimate hope, as he stated in the overview, was that understanding the predictable nature of this convergence of biology, intelligence, and opportunity, it doesn't reduce the horror, but it does allow for clearer, more focused judgment, and the possibility of both individual and societal learning.
Right.
We stop treating these events as mystical anomalies and start recognizing them as structural risks that demand structural solutions.
And if we connect this back to the therapeutic guide, the long-term objective for survivors is the complete transformation of identity, from victim to survivor, and finally to a self-determined adult. This process of reclaiming agency and identity is the ultimate measure of success after structural harm.
And this raises an important final question for us and for you, the listener, to mull over. If the goal is that forward identity development and the transformation of the self, what are the critical systemic ingredients beyond individual therapy required for society to support this final stage of healing and provide safe passage for those who have suffered such profound structural harm?